Today's first reading recalls one of several stories about political and military conflict between David and Saul. And although Saul was the king of Israel at the time, he had lost favor with God because of his failure to carry out his mission according to God's will. In the meantime, David, who had been secretly anointed to become king and eventually take Saul's place, found favor with God, and God handed David several victories as one of Saul's military leaders, including killing Goliath. The Israelites made him a hero, celebrating the victory in song, saying, "Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands." And this infuriated King Saul, as he now saw David as a threat to his kingdom. It led Saul down a path of jealousy and rage that would eventually consume him. And from that point, he tried to kill David by either putting him into a dangerous situation or directly trying to kill him. Saul pursued David for many years and tried to kill him at least 10 times without success, as God was with David and not with Saul. And this is the context for our first reading. Saul and his army of 3,000 are looking for David, who has his own army of only 600. But when night came, David and Abishai snuck behind enemy lines and found Saul surrounded by his men, asleep with his spear thrust into the ground near his head. Abishai says, "God has delivered your enemy into your grasp." And he asked David to let him kill Saul with a spear. Instead, David says, "Do not harm him, for he is the Lord's anointed." So they took his spear and a corner of his garment and departed. All the times that Saul had tried to kill David, and still, David respects God's anointing more than revenge. David, who had God's favor, chose to trust God again, as he had many times before. Abishai, on the other hand, must have thought David was crazy for passing up this opportunity for revenge. God calls us to that kind of crazy. After that, David has Saul's spear returned to him, confirming that David was not Saul's enemy and he didn't want to harm him. Pardon the generalization, but just like this story from our first reading, there are 3 basic types of people in the world. First, there are bad people like Saul. Second, there are good people like Abishai. And the third type are godlike people, the children of God like David, who in the book of Acts is called a man after God's own heart. The bad people hurt those who have done nothing to them. The good people love those who love them back. And the godlike people love those who love them, and they also love those who hate them. And we can't do that without help. In our second reading, we find strength and encouragement for the natural good man who is destined to fail without help of the heavenly man who is Jesus. Jesus came to restore the order we need, since we are not called to live natural lives, but supernatural lives. And in our gospel, we have some very difficult teachings. In fact, these teachings, I would say, make sense only for people who are sharing in the divine life. Otherwise, good people hear these words and say, "This is impossible to live out in this crazy world that we live in." Jesus is challenging us to rise above being good. Jesus wants us to become godlike, and we can only become God's children if we are kind to everyone, the way God is kind to everyone. In the gospel, the word love is agape. This word is found 341 times in the New Testament. And every single book of the Bible, of the New Testament. But it takes a little to understand it. The word love in the American language is a little obscure, if you will. So agape is a Greek word, and it means this: an attitude more than an emotion. It means desiring the other's good, putting oneself in the place of another, not deterred by hatred, cursing, or abuse. And it seeks nothing for itself and expects nothing in return. Another definition that I like, that is my working definition for love. St. Thomas Aquinas said this about love: love is willing the good of the other as other in accordance to God's will. And if we look back at our first reading, we find that David confronted Saul in a loving way and a nonviolent way, and diffused what had been a bitter rivalry, not through weakness or giving in, but by a huge risk. In this case, a risk that could have cost David his life. But with God's help, the rivalry was resolved, as David and Saul later came together and agreed not to harm each other ever again. Loving people and loving difficult people is for the gracious and not for the weak. The word agapao is the verb for agape, and it's an active verb, not a passive phrase. For instance, turning the other cheek is not a sign of weakness. It is a stand, your ground kind of phrase. Desmond Tutu was a South African Anglican bishop at a time when apartheid was running wild. And he was traveling down the street on a boardwalk. The boardwalk was above a muddy road beneath. And he approached a man on this boardwalk. And the man coming toward him was white, and Desmond Tutu was black. The white man was a racist. As he came up to him, he said, "Move aside," to Desmond Tutu. "I don't make room for gorillas." Desmond Tutu looked at him and said, "I do." And he stepped aside and let the man go. Mother Teresa was once in a bakery with a child and asked for bread for the child. The baker spat in her face. Mother Teresa turned to the baker and said, "Thank you for that gift for me. Now perhaps something for the child." This is the kind of love that we are talking about. These actions reflect back to the person who's the violent person, their violence, in a way that's like a mirror. They can see this violence, and there's a chance for recovery after that, just like Saul and just like David. You know, most of the time we don't have to go looking for difficult people. They tend to find us. So what am I doing to help people God has put in my world? I think that's the question we can all ask. If I look down the list in the gospel, God has given me the opportunity to deal with at least one of these people, and I bet He's put them into your life as well. What have I done with those opportunities? Because they truly are opportunities. Think of our workplaces, our families, and our friends, and for that matter, in this very church. But then we too can be the source of someone else's pain, can't we? Ultimately, the question is, Can we give the way God gives, expecting nothing in return? God gives the sun and the rain to the saint and the sinner alike. Can we be as generous with the gifts we have been given? As this is how we become children of God. And so now, let us ready ourselves through prayer for the ultimate gift we're about to receive from the altar of God.